on this event at the very first day of this series on Mahatma Gandhi. On behalf of the Mahatma Gandhi Center for Conflict Resolution and Peace Studies of Department of Philosophy, Lady Keane College, Shillong, India, Northeast Institute of Social Sciences and Research, Dimapur, Nagaland, Peace Channel of Nagaland, St. Xavier College, Jalukie, Nagaland. Welcome each and everyone who have joined to this webinar series on the theme Spirituality, Satyagraha and Pragmatism, New Dimensions in Gandhian Philosophy. It is great that about a century and a half later, we still remember the legacy left behind by our great Mahatma across the globe. The institutions that I have mentioned proudly welcome you all to this landlocked region of the confluence of multiple cultures and to the midst of this peace-loving people of the region. To the east of this region, we have Southeast. We open to the Southeast countries, beginning from Myanmar to the Vietnam. But to the west of this country, we open to the vast plains of India and also to the Arab nations, Pakistan. But the region is called Northeast because it is at the tip of the north and east of our country. But it's a confluence of cultures. While we have Indo-Aryan culture on one side, on the other side we have Mongolite culture of commerce. It had not been a great effort on our part. It was rather not a hard task to get the galaxy of wonderful erudite scholars, as my request as the coordinator had been taken very kindly by these resource persons who are there in our midst today. They took it with care and kindness. So we have them in our midst. As has been on the broader theme, the focus of this webinar series would be on spirituality, Satyagraha and pragmatism. The ever-felt need of spirituality in this contemporary times is growing far and wide because we have just came over the second wave of the pandemic scenario that we have been entangled with. So the need for spirituality is going more and more. While in the Western pedagogical discourses, the gap between materialism and spiritualism is vast and indomitable. In the East, we find considerable overlaps between these two aspects. The classic work on religion and experience within American pragmatism was written by William James more than a century ago. Charles Sanders Peirce and John Dewey need mention here, as their late 19th and early 20th century writings contributed immensely towards the rejection of any absolutism. At present, both these regions, I mean the West and the East, show a deep longing for a new vision, a concurrent model that adds profound significance to all material and non-material aspects of everyday life. However, the last and the present century witnessed many thinkers attempting a fusion of these two distinctive modes of life. Gandhi came into a situation of struggle and tries to apply spiritualistic principles in the domain of conscious battle, which fights enslavement and ultimately proving to the world the need of its application in all spheres of life. Spiritualism in him has its predominant morality. There is some audio disturbance, excuse me. Madam Shail Kumari, you're welcome. Kindly mute yourself. Kindly mute yourself. The introductory lecture is on. We'll invite you a little later. Please mute yourself, Madam Shail Kumari. You're welcome. Thank you. In the Eastern traditions, the Upanishads claim all knowledge is founded and emerge out of a transpersonal self called Atma. This is a self-referential process. There is an immanent transcendence of the consciousness which can be reached by every individual human being. In order to integrate the theoretical concepts of Western humanities and social sciences, one needs to consider the ontological and transcendental dimensions of self in philosophical traditions of Vedic literature. The creative self, its embeddedness in language, culture, practices, and tradition should not blind us and be kept away from the need of a scrutiny of its significance in any context. This is a framework of pragmatism. The openness of the cultures, traditions, and practices to critique and revisions and their internal relation to intersubjective recognition is a necessity. Satyagraha, as its relevance in itself being an activity, a karma, rather than restricting to an internalizing and being a meditative exercise. The ideas of reason, truth, justice also serve as ideals with reference to which we can reason or rationalize our traditions that we inherit. The self, thus, ought to be ahistorical, social, embodied, practical, desirous of knowing, and also an acting subject. The self is not to represent, according to me, a closed and a complete system. Self needs to be ever-growing and intersubjective. Habermas does this rejection of paradigm of consciousness and argues in favor of a thorough intersubjective communicative action. The transcendence of the self through a process of constant interaction, but that does not lead to its absoluteness, unlike that of absolute self and absolute knowledge pointed out by our Hegel. Now, the question that comes to our mind is about these cultures. Have the cultures come over this absoluteness? This question needs answers from a standpoint of pragmatism. The pragmatistic light, according to me, in contemporary times should be thrown open onto these cultures to undergo the scrutiny of justification, social justification. Everything emerges from an unbounded self. However, beyond the reality of the self as a subject, what is more important is the means of knowing. Thus, epistemology, where Satyagraha carries its relevance, is important to explore. It would literally be translated as persistence on knowing and realizing the truth. The end also lies in realization of the truth. Obviously, the means for Gandhi is non-violence. Gandhi's advocacy of non-violence is the part of his legacy that is most cherished by the modern liberal imagination. Satyagraha is a sadhana. It is an ever-persistent desire to know the truth which emerges out of the deeper layer of the self. Once spiritual aspect is ingrained, conscious understanding of the self and non-self and the world at large. Not in the sense of the othering. The other is not to be understood as the othering. Indian culture never takes the other as something which is non-self. All consciousness is a part of the integrated unity of consciousness. In its pragmatic consideration, spirituality has its layers linked to ascriptions of the existential reality rather than the essence. I quote Vivek Dharmeshwar in 2011 in one of the books edited by Akhil Bilgrami. He wrote, Gandhi's Satyagraha was an attempt to set up sites of ethical learning that would again make possible reflection on experience. He means to convey that Gandhian spirituality is linked only to morality. So what rather Gandhi meant by spiritualism was founded on moral principles only. Truth finding, as for time immemorial, had been the concern of philosophers. Rather, philosophers had been engrossed with this activity of truth finding and justifying propositions to be true or false. Let me conclude by saying that the ethical aspect of persistence on truth is ingrained in the concept of Satyagraha, and this Satyagraha is also a verb. It is an activity, it is an action, it is a karma, and also at the same time a dharma. For about 3 hours that we have today, that we engage on this theme, let us deliberate on the concepts as is mentioned here. Let us deliberate on the concepts as is mentioned here. And I believe with the out-of-box keynote which is going to come soon, and with the wonderful presentations which is going to come today from Dr. Ravi Chandramurthy, Professor Michael Myers, and Dr. Prasenjit Biswas, and also on 25th next Saturday from Professor Xavier Mao as the chairperson, Dr. Christian Bartov from Germany, Professor Anandakumar Giri, and Nicholas F. Geyer from USA, and its culmination on Gandhi Jayanti, that is on the 2nd of October, at the chair Professor Meera Chakravarti, Professor Joe Campbell, Dr. P. Milan Karma Kangmacha, Samiksha Goyal. All these presentations would enrich us in knowing the ideologies of Gandhi further. For about a century, we have been talking about this. But primarily, the focus of our attention would be on his ideologies and its application in day-to-day life in contemporary times. Thank you very much for your patient hearing. As I mentioned about this region is rich in its culture and its art and also the traditions of music. We are very fortunate to have a confluence of Rabindra Sangeet in this region and also Hindustani. To begin a Gandhian series of webinars, how apt would it be to begin it with a song which is liked the most by Gandhiji, Vaishnava Janako? We have a retired professor of LS College, Muzaffarpur, Bihar, Professor Shail Kumari. I welcome Madam Shail Kumari to present this beautiful song. She is accompanied by her team of instrumentalists. Madam, the floor is yours.
Thank
Madam,
you.
yes.
Thank you, Varghese.
Please present your song. We are waiting for you. Yes.
Respected Principal, Professor Rakesh Chandra, Chairperson of this academic session, and several professors and eminent professors from different countries of this international webinar. I am proud of being former professor and head of PG Department of Philosophy of the esteemed institution LS College, Muzaffarpur, Bihar. This historic college of repute had an opportunity to be visited by Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, who was then an advocate only. He came here in 1917 on 10th April and stayed here. He took bath on the well. It's now Gandhi Coop as a historical heritage. He conversed with some advocates and lawyers about the farmers of Champaran who were badly oppressed with Tinkatia tradition and depressed by the Britishers. He began his Champaran Satyagraha from this prestigious college. So, this institution is the door to Champaran Kranti. After his successful achievement of Champaran Satyagraha, Guru Rabindranath Tagore called him as Mahatma. I am overwhelmed to be invited by the organizers of this auspicious international webinar, especially Sajji Varghese and Principal Sahib. Today, I shall sing his loving bhajan, written by Gujarati Bhakt Narsingh Mehta, Vaishnav Janto Tene Kahiye Je. I do request Dr. Rajan Kumar to play on the harmonium and Mr. Hariji to play on the naal. So allow me to start. वैष्णव जन तो तेने कहिए जे, वैष्णव जन तो तेने कहिए जे, पीर पराई जाने रे। वैष्णव जन तो तेने कहिए जे, पीर पराई जाने रे। वैष्णव जन तो तेने कहिए। वज्र दुखे उपकार करे तोए, दुखे उपकार करे तोए, मन अभिमान आए रे। वैष्णव जन तो तेने कहिए जे, पीर पराई जाने दे। वैष्णव जन तो तेने कहिए जे। सकल लोक सहुने वंदे, सकल लोक सहुने वंदे, निंदा न करे रे। वाच काच मन वाच काच मन निश्चल राखे, धन धन जननी देनी रे।
वैष्णव जन तो तेने कहिए जे पीड़ बराई जाने रे। वैष्णव जन तो तेने कहिए समदृष्टि ने तृष्णा त्यागी, समदृष्टि ने तृष्णा त्यागी, पर स्त्री जन मात रे। जिहवा थकी सत्य न बोले, जिहवा थकी असत्य न बोले, पर धन नव जाले हाथ रे। वैष्णव जन तो तेने कहिए जे पीड़ बराई जाने रे। वैष्णव जन तो तेने कहिए मोह माया नहीं झेने, मोह माया नहीं झेने, दृढ़ वैराग्य जेनो मन मोरे। राम नाम आली लागी, राम नाम ताली लागी, सकल तीरथ वैष्णव जन तो तेने कहिए पीड़ बराई जाने रे। वैष्णव जन तो तेने कहिए बनलोगी ने कपट रहित चेने, बनलोगी ने कपट रहित चेने, काम क्रोध माया रे। बड़े नर सैया तनु दर्शन करता, बड़े नर सैयो तेनु दर्शन करता, कुल एको तेरे कार्य दे। वैष्णव जन तो तेने कहिए जे पीड़ बराई जाने रे। वैष्णव जन तो तेने कहिए जे पीड़ बराई जाने रे। अभिमाने मारे रे वैष्णव जन तो जय कहिए वैष्णव जन तो जय कहिए वैष्णव जन तो जय कहिए।
Thank you so much, Madam Shail Kumari. Thank you for this beautiful rendition. All Gandhian scholars would have known this. This is a bhajan, the bhajan which Gandhi himself used to sing, Mahatma Gandhi himself used to sing almost every day. Once again, thank you very much, Madam.
Thank
Now
you.
it's time to invite Professor Rakesh Chandra. We are in fact behind schedule by at least 15 minutes. Professor Rakesh Chandra, we are in fact very fortunate to have him accept this request of mine to deliver this keynote presentation. He is the head of the Department of Philosophy and also Dean of Academics. He has done extensive work on feminism and women's studies. He is also heading the Institute for Women's Studies in Lucknow University. There is a long list of publications. Because of the paucity of time, I'm not reading out this list, but you will get to know in the way he deliberates on and how he inspires the scholars to take up the work and also to do the projects on various topics that he himself is doing his projects on, how inspiring he would be. One presentation that I have heard of him doing in Lakshmibai College about 2 years ago, it still inspires me because he is always an out-of-the-box presentation that he comes out with. When we think about dharma and karma, Mahabharata, Ramayana, but he would come out with something which is for the contemporary times. That is the greatness of Professor Rakesh Chandra. We are privileged and blessed to have him in our midst here. Sir, let me humbly welcome you to the floor, and the floor is yours. We have maybe 40 minutes of your presentation and then 20 minutes for interaction. If that is fine with you, sir. Over to you, sir. Sir, not audible, not audible. We can't hear you.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Saji Verghese, for calling me over, for talking and sharing some of my views on Gandhi. I'm also, while I'm happy, I'm also not so happy because I'm missing the beautiful locales of your beautiful college, the Keane College at Shillong. I still remember the beautiful building, the lace curtains, and the excellent faculty and hospitality that I enjoyed last time when I was at your college. Thank you very much, Professor Verghese. I hope we will have time and you would not forget that I want to come to your college once again. As we remember Mahatma Gandhi, I want to call my presentation Some Reflections on Gandhi, Culture, Globalization, Feminism, and the Feminine. But since it's the beginning of the conference, let me also do a quick kind of a recap on something which we all know, but I think we should constantly remind ourselves when we think of Mahatma Gandhi, and a brief biographical story about him. That born on October 2, 1869, Porbandar, Kathiawar, betrothed at 7 and married at 13. The whole account that we find of his own inadequacies as a child, in my experiments with truth, in his autobiography, up to 1925. And this, I think, also needs to be remembered, that actually the biography contains only elements up to 1925. How he talks about that when he got married, he wanted to play a husband, in which he failed. How he wanted to be a speaker in the school, but he failed. How he tried to become a meat eater because he wanted to crush the British, and he was told that British was stronger because they ate meat, and how he failed. How he failed as an initial lawyer. All those ideas of failure are so honestly recorded that every time you read it, you find that you may or may not be appreciative of everything that Gandhiji did in his life, but you can't question his absolute moral integrity and honesty. The farewell party, he read an article on Indian franchise in South Africa, which he thought was contrary to self-respect. He, as part of his biography also, which I think always I remember, is his reading of Ruskin's Unto the Last at the Phoenix Farm in Durban. And then what I find extremely surprising, with which I want all of us to remember, that when you look at Gandhi's writing, there are 90 volumes of collected works. And as I said, that someone who could not speak gave speeches, interviews, spun yarns, led prayer meetings, solved disputes, responded to critics, led campaigns, served the sick. How did he have time and energy enough to write so much that could be put into 90 volumes? He applied the eternal principles of truth and nonviolence to our daily life and problems. And like a child, what occurred to me, that what was it that spurred him to that? So he's not hung up on consistency. He accepts growth. He accepts Bhagavad Gita, particularly the Anasakti Yoga interpretation. 24 years in South Africa, and then finally, with the Great Freedom Movement, died an unhappy man on January 30, 1948. And again, though we repeat it again and again and again, I always think it is appropriate to remember that remark by Albert Einstein, that generations to come, it will be difficult for them to believe that such a one as this ever lived in flesh and blood walked on earth. And I want to also, as a part of personal biographical note, I want to say that, for Gandhi has been of a personal interest to me in many different reasons. Personally, my mother was part of the many foot soldiers of Gandhi. And she was there in his prayer meeting on the 29th. She could have also been on 30th, but she couldn't go that day. She used to go for Prabhat Feris. She was a student at the IP college at that time. And she was forbidden by her brother to go that. And so she was taunted because her brothers were working for the British service. Then when she got married into a family of feudal people, where again, my father's mother and the others kept on taunting her. Your Gandhi took away our lands, because they were feudal lords, and because of Gandhi, they were taken out. She also found it difficult to come, when she married in Lucknow, to sit on a rickshaw, because actually parrot run by men. And then again, for academic reasons, I have a great deal of difficulty as well as challenge as I read Mahatma Gandhi, the great soul of resistance, Mahatma Gandhi, as he was called, who led and mesmerized the Indian masses, which followed him across classes, caste, and gender, to protest against the British colonialism. Students had left the British-style schools, elite gave up titles, lawyers gave up courts, women came unveiled, and Gandhi exposed to the world, including the British, their complete lack of moral authority to govern India. I have a great difficulty, as I also said, especially as a philosophy teacher, trying to place Gandhi, who rather awkwardly sits with the philosophers because in different parts of the world. And also, I find it very difficult to deal with Gandhi as a feminist. Then, of course, as Shaji said, the question is about Gandhi's relevance to globalization and the emerging social order. I have, of course, two very fundamental methodological concerns. One is that do individuals and their intentions running counter to culture play a role in transformation? Do individuals really change the current? Or do existing systems of meaning compel and coerce individuals in ways that no cultural innovation is possible? So is Gandhi a product of his time and place, or is he working and counter to the current and then creating a new world order, so to say? So if we are looking at scholars like Engels and other determinists, and if they are right that any utopian hope, including Gandhi's, cannot work until the material conditions are right, then we have one interpretation. But there does seem to be a way of looking at history where human agency and cultural innovation is looked at as realization in social networks. And Gandhi must be looked at as both a product as well as a transformer of culture. And as I said, I wish to share with you just some stray reflections on Gandhi as they relate to globalization and some issues of femininity and feminism. So what is Gandhi's utopia? Sometimes called the Gandhian socialism, sometimes called Indian socialism, sometimes called the Sarvodaya, sometimes called Gandhian economics, sometimes called decentralized economic development, and sometimes even called Indian anarchism. This utopian vision consists in one, reordering of society, which has an economic policy. So which would include decentralized economic development and the Sarvodaya economy. And secondly, it conceives of a revolutionary reconstitution of social life, which includes anarchism, Sarvodaya, and socialism. So human values are promoted here, which Western capitalism and socialism downgrade or negate. And these are now presented with Indian roots. The pre-independent Gandhian vision has the shadow of course, big stalwarts from India, Vivekananda, Aurobindo, Annie Besant, Margaret Noble, who was subsequently called Sister Nivedita. Spirituality of Ram Mohan, Rabindranath Tagore, Bankim Chand. Village cooperation harmony, Swadeshi, and Panchayat Raj. So Gandhi was trying, like many others, including Sri Aurobindo, to reject the idea that India was otherworldly, passive, effeminate, superstitious culture, which had to be saved by the West. I was just talking in this morning for about an hour on Sri Aurobindo, his lecture, especially on the Indian Renaissance, published in 1920, where he constantly tries to show that actually this idea that India is only spiritual, Mayavadan, Buddhist, world-denying is actually incorrect, and the Western perception of the self needed to be corrected. And this is the theory which he gave 60 years before Edward Said's Orientalism. So Gandhi thought of, like Aurobindo, thought of a future India could be more humane, spiritual, enlightened, and egalitarian. And this utopian vision, according to some scholars, developed mainly between 1893 to 1915 and included the Satyagraha, Ahimsa, and all his movements of mass action. Gandhi said, I may be taunted with the retort that all this is utopian. But then he says, and this I think I repeat it so often now that I get tired of saying this myself, it is, if Euclid's point, though incapable of being drawn by human agency, has an imperishable value, my picture has its own for mankind to live. Euclid's line is one without breath, but no one has so far been able to draw it and never will. All the same, it is only by keeping the ideal line in mind that we have made progress in geometry. What is true here is true of every ideal. So ideals, though unrealizable, are aspirational and worth striving for. So Gandhi's utopia, like all utopia, like all ideals, is worth sustaining precisely for the reason that Euclid's line and Euclid's point are as fundamental not only to the development of geometry, but to all construction of any building or anything whatsoever. Satyagraha, his ideal, authorized him as a national leader. And by authorization here, I mean not somebody who becomes an authority in and by himself, but somebody who is authorized by people. So he was authorized by the people as a national leader. As you know, he never became a minister. He never became a leader by any other way. He was so important that he stopped the movement for independence on several occasions, notably Chauri Chaura in 1927. It is interesting to note that Gene Sharp in 1979 says that whereas only 8,000 died in the Congress campaign, if it had taken the shape of the Algerian struggle, the casualty would have been 3 to 3.5 million. There are many, many people now, I see them screaming on television about that, how other more militant leaders were more important. But we know that, the British and the whole of Europe knew how to fight guns, how to fight cannons. The only thing they did not know, and the world did not know, was how to fight a man and a mob and a whole country of people who were speaking or working only through moral courage, without weapons, without even a lathi. This is not to say that non-violence was adopted because it was functional, because it was useful, because it was strategic. It was accepted on principle, not on utilitarian calculation. Partho Chatterjee thinks that Gandhian Ahimsa and Satyagraha curtailed the peasant protest. This is his version. Shumit Sharkar and Gyan Pandey think that Congress could not discipline the local protests. So there are many questions to how the movement processed. Gandhi spoke of harmony and no special privileges either to the minority or the transcendental in form of separate electorate. Gandhi was constantly questioned in his own time. Can India become free without violence? And even today I see so many majors screaming and calling names to Gandhi. Many writers like William Barman, Robert Holmes, Gerald Richards try to read Gandhi as someone who allows for justifiable violence in extreme cases and uses non-violence only tactically. Gandhi, as Martin Luther King and many others rightly understood, emphasized that non-violent resistance is not a method for the cowards. Brave warriors can take a step to non-violence. And there's this famous case which we all must remember. He went to northeast frontier, Nifa as it was called, to meet the fierce Pathans with Abdul Ghaffar Khan, who was later called the Frontier Gandhi, to teach them how to fight without fear. They came with big guns on their back. And he asked, are you afraid? The big Pathans with guns. And he said, are you afraid? And the leader Khan became Frontier Gandhi. And they said, no, we are not afraid. And Gandhi said, but why are you carrying guns? I'm not afraid. I'm not carrying a gun. You must be afraid that you are carrying guns. That was the courage of the man. In some discussions, Gandhi is seen as preferring some actions or steps for transformative change. Violent defense is preferred to cowardly flight. Non-violent man or woman should die without anger. This is the highest form of bravery. If unwilling or unable, retaliation or resistance unto death is second best, but a long way from the first. Cowardice is worse than violence. Gandhi is a revolutionary, a votary of equal distribution. But he is very importantly saying that means are as important as the ends. Violence fails because it is counterproductive. Gandhi challenged modernity's paradigm of violence. Gandhi aspired for more than independence. Through that, he wanted a deliverance of India. I seek to deliver it from so-called weakness of races, from the crush and not only the crushing heels of Western civilization. Gandhi saw main contradiction between colonization of the British and the whole Indian population, not as a class struggle like Marx between Indians, as Bipin Chandra writes. He was able to bring a class reconciliation, and this led to independence, but deferred the revolution, according to people like Sumit Sarkar. Bipin Chandra does not agree with the reading of Sumit Sarkar, that Gandhi's vision served some class interest of the bourgeoisie, because this is also one popular kind of reading, that actually he was serving the bourgeois interest. The fragile class coalition was kept intact, though through his moral voice, Gandhi's ideas of trusteeship, non-violence, and consensus were contested by many radicals in his own time. He kept on insisting on raising peasants of rural India with intensive products, with labor-intensive products, rather than encourage class enmity. When you think of the Brazilian educator Paulo Freire, in many ways you see that echoed. Gandhi increasingly worked against urban power bases of Nehruvian industrial model. Gandhi was not accepted as an authority. Constantly, he had to seek reauthorization. If you look at the documents of that time and the history of that time, not everybody accepted him, and constantly he had to fight for his position. We see him seeing himself as a failure, not heard by his own proteges, including Nehru, who did not even invite him subsequently when he was dying. He failed against Muslim separatism. Many think big business and rich peasants used Gandhi as they were saved from conflicts. Gandhi was, of course, human and made by circumstances, but he took authorship for all his failure. Did he fail? Or we need to see that he does not fail? This is the kind of question which I would constantly come back. His efforts in South Africa and Indian promulgation of non-violence as Satyagraha are very important. Calling it passive resistance, of course, was narrow. And as I said, was repeating, he never thought that it was a weapon of the weak. He actually said, Satyagraha, Sat means truth, and force is what I want to say in terms of Agraha. So it is force of truth, not just restraint of violent behavior, but avoidance of evil thought. That is his Ahimsa. Non-violence as a transformative force, not to embarrass the wrongdoer, to come and convert or to coerce. He should be inwardly convinced. He who knows truth will act accordingly. So this is a very Platonic resonance, that actually the person who does wrong is actually a person who doesn't know what is right. If you knew right, you would do the right thing. So this does not admit of the Duryodhan kind, jana api dharmam, nachame pravrittam. Does not talk of akrasya. It talks in a very Platonic sense that actually moral failure is actually moral ignorance. Ahimsa requires deliberate self-suffering, not injuring the wrongdoer. Those who want change must be ready to suffer with patience. True change comes from within, not from pressure. What is the negative requirement of non-violence, non-injury of any living being by body or mind? What is the positive requirement? Largest love and the greatest charity. Heart must be an inseparable part of our very being. Love is necessary for non-violence, but not of what is wrongdoer does. Deed and doer are separate. Hate the sin and not the sinner. This is what we keep on saying to ourselves. So there's no vilification, but civility with fearlessness. Incivilities spoil Satyagraha like a drop of arsenic in milk. Zara si bhi badtamizi, uncivility nahi honi chahiye. Very difficult to practice. Not outward gentleness of speech, but an inborn gentleness and a desire to do the apparent good. Harsh tongue, shirking duty, not greeting, getting angry, all are taken as violence according to Gandhi. Now the question, of course, always with all young people and all senior people also, does non-violence work? And the answer, in India, it did. Scandinavia against the Nazis, civil rights movement in the United States, the ending of the Vietnam War, getting down to the Berlin War, the ending of apartheid in South Africa, all these happened after Gandhi was gone. So it did work for him, for us, and it does work today. As this happened after Gandhi, all this has happened. In armed struggle, you're ready to die. In Satyagraha, you expect to live or to enjoy. No, but that's also illogical, said Gandhi. In Satyagraha, more than in armed warfare, it may be said that we find life in losing it. So Satyagraha is not a strategy to save your own life. You are in fact forsaking your life. You are in fact sacrificing your life more in the Satyagraha. The very important question which everybody asks, would Satyagraha have worked against the Nazis? And Gandhi was made to address this question. Will it work against the Nazis? And Gandhi thought so. The soldiery would melt, active confrontation, not yielding. Experience of the Garhwal rifles, the loyal unit who refused the British orders. They said, they have neither lathis nor stones. Why should we fire them? How can we fire on these people? Non-cooperation. A whole people unwilling to conform to the laws, ready to bear consequences. The police wants to go to the ideal of retaliation. They were also ready to suffer. So history and ideal both have proved that. In the introduction to his autobiography in 1925, he answers a very interesting question. What did Gandhi want to achieve? And he says three things: self-realization, seeking God face to face, and moksha. All my work by way of speaking and writing, all my ventures in political field, I devoted to this. But as I have all along believed that what is possible for one is possible for all, my experiments have not been conducted in a closet, but in the open. And I do not think that this fact detracts from their spiritual value. Some communicable experience between the maker and the self. His experiments are spiritual rather than moral, for the essence of religion is morality. Did he succeed? Did he see God face to face? Is he completely freed from sin? In 1918, he first speaks of the small, inner, irresistible voice, sublime for him, contentious for others. Gopalachari said he is having a hallucination because of the overheated walls in jail. Gandhi speaks of the voice afar but close. He's not dreaming, ego reduced to zero, surrender to Satyanarayan. Conscience is not willfulness, but obedience in a delicately tuned breast. He speaks of the Epadesh Vrat, Ahimsa, Satya, Asteya, Brahmacharya, Parigraha, Sharir, Kshaya, Swad, Sarvatra Bhayavarjan, Sarvadharam Samanvay, Swadeshi, and Sparsh Bhavana. So he speaks of all of these as part of his own thing. He speaks of prayer as waiting for God, preparing for purification, the spirit of Anasakti, the inwardness, Ram as Atma Ram. He doesn't speak of the Dashrati Ram, he speaks of Atma Ram. From outwardness to inwardness, worship of truth alone is, according to him, the Brahmacharya. Upavas brings closeness to God, and it is the sacrifice or the yajna. Jesus, of course, is his ideal of sacrifice. He was writing on the Sermon on the Mount, as you know. In 1922, he reads the Ishavasya Upanishad. In 1923, he reads Aurobindo's commentary on Gita. He's convinced that God pervades everything. Nothing is exempt from the jurisdiction of Isha. We need to consume with the spirit of the aparigraha. He had the desire to live not up to 99 plus 1, but 120 years. He gives himself to the Ram Naam. He sleeps well like a baby, but not after Noah Khali. He becomes an insomniac. Ramganj, Begamganj, Lakshmipur, Chayania, Hajiganj, 10th October 1946, 5,000 people killed, raped, converted. Gandhi camped for 4 months, but did not succeed. He fasted. Ram Nam was now failing him. He believed that he failed in his brahmacharya. If he was perfect brahmachari, no ailment inside, no violence outside, because he was firmly believing yatha pinde tata brahmande. If everything is going wrong outside, it must be because there's something wrong inside. If I purify myself, I'll be able to correct something outside. He really believed that. So he thought that I am sullied. He said, so long as there is untouchability, no truth can prevail. By 1927, he gave himself the authority that whatever I'll do will actually make a difference. The great Vyasa had erred, he said, against the caste system. He reinterpreted also the Sermon on the Mount. In 1930, where is the seat of authority? Everybody asked him, how do you get all this? And he touched his breast. It resides here, my teacher. And that is the power of the man. It would be of interest to see that all nations of the world, as they write their human development indexes right now, they are talking about accountability, information inclusion, local organizational capacity as key to human empowerment and poverty reduction. There's, of course, a huge emphasis on promoting dialogue between poor people's organizations, government officials, policymakers, private sectors to initiate regulation and innovation. There are also now e-links, which are trying to build global networks of trading partners, which can provide services to community-based artisans, producer groups, eliminating complicated networks of middlemen. Importance of decentralization for empowerment is being linked to democratization, though in many cases it has been driven by failure of centralized systems to deliver basic services to reduce national fiscal deficits. However, here, I think it would be wise to see the Gandhian idea of moving decision-making power closer to the people. And here, we see it, if it is heeded as essential for sustainable development. This is combined with social accountability, for which Gandhiji had more than one mechanism to offer, the overarching being his talisman, which enjoins that each action must be seen as what it does for the poor. This is sometimes seen close to the principle accepted by John Rawls as one agreed upon by those under the veil of ignorance. Gandhi's life exemplified one major issue of non-separation of the private and the public self. As feminists, we have appreciated the strong need to see the personal as the political, because a large part of the women's exploitation was not addressed in the public domain as it was considered as a family issue. Feminists underlined that wherever there is a power distribution, there is politics, and family and interpersonal relationships are the seat of power struggle. Gandhi believed in much the same and did not exempt the personal from the social, moral, and political scrutiny. Though there are many questions we may ask on Gandhi's treatment of women on specific occasions, his overarching concern for women as inclusive framework cannot be missed. It may be interesting to see Gandhi with reference to the feminine, not as a feminist. I have this to say. The feminine is a stereotype of gender construction. It sometimes seems that he very deliberately demasculinized his identity. He adapted the all so-called feminine virtues, abstinence from violence, cooking, cleaning, caring, weaving, none of which could be valorized by masculine colonizers, hegemonic totalitarian socialists, or the native golden age revivalists who are talking about the great soldiers of the Gupta age. Self-denial, simplicity, forbearance, and sacrifice, which he demanded of himself and others, were never considered to be masculinely appropriate. So the dress that he wore, something like a single sari, one single thought, on many occasions he did say that in his Satyagraha was more continuous with a woman's life of denial, but he converted the denial into resistance. He never ceases to acknowledge that he actually learned it from his wife, Ba. It is true that feminist agenda of equality and women's suffrage was not accepted by Gandhi at once. And as Sarla Devi Chaudhrani writes, women were assigned positions of lawbreakers, but not as lawmakers by the Congress. So Gandhi tried to rewrite women's passivity and self-suffering as strength. And his movement had the largest number of women in public life, both educated as well as illiterate. Gandhi's involvement of women was both strategic and moral. Women's movement has many questions on Gandhi, particularly about Congress's paternalism and asking women to go back to their homes after the emergencies were over. Gandhi's experiments of self-resistance involved women without their consent, on regard of their mental health. His disregard of Kasturba on certain occasions is also shown his human frailty. But Gandhi's overall humanism is never suspect. As against all forms of aggressive politics of nationalism, socialism, or capitalism, Gandhian concern for care does have a feminist resonance. It is also important that as we recently deliberate on the issues of violence against women, Gandhi's categorizations come handy, where he takes psychological, social, economic, and violence of intention also as violence. So when you look at the categories of violence against women in Charlotte Bunch, you are strangely reminded of Gandhi. Some worry about Gandhi's excessive emphasis on purity with reference to women. But this would be incorrect vision, because what he said to the prostitutes, etc., is often quoted that he demanded over purity. But this he demanded as much in men. He may be charged of demanding excessive self-denial, but he cannot be charged in this case of sexism. In terms of the new globalized order, there is perhaps need for some patient reconsideration. Globalization is not colonization. Colonization does not have even a scope for reciprocity. It is essentially oppressive and exploitative. Globalization, on the other hand, has the possibility of reciprocity, though it does not have it as of now. It is well known that Gandhi, in terms of ideas, did not discriminate between ideas in terms of geographically originating articulation. He, in his own time, took to stylish dressing, to vegetarianism, because of a Western ideal, as a Western influence. He took Plato, Thor, Tolstoy with Buddha and Gita. Everyone here seems to emphasize his Indian roots, but we need to reconsider that. He knew of very little of his own religion in India. When he went abroad, he understood Christianity, then he came back, and then he understood more of the so-called Indian originated religions. He would have criticized the conquering Digvijayis of the yore and the materialistic Indian empire builders as much as he did criticize the neo-capitalists. His Indian heroes and heroines are interestingly more often than not the mythological rather than historical. Local economies suffer by exploitation through large company networks, but in many cases, new market opportunities are also created. India's relation in ancient times was as much through ideas as through trade of silk. Closure is not the answer. The response is to rise up and struggle for equal partnership in the globe. Gandhi had fiercely reached to burning of English newspaper, reacted to fiercely to the burning of English newspapers. He enjoined to create new, desirable, better vernacular quality. Deification of Gandhi, of course, is problematic, for it makes him non-human. Much the same has often happened with women. You say, "Auratein to devi hoti hain," where they are made goddesses and denied humanity. Gandhi deserves close attention as an experimental scientist. Fortunately, there is some recent publication on looking at Gandhi as a prisoner of hope or Gandhi's Utopia and many such literature. As I often hear that much of Gandhi is utopian. Gandhi himself, as I said, was very forthright. He said, utopian visions and dreams motivate us to continue our struggle. They require experimentation. To achieve them, which in turn requires confrontation with existing systems of authority and legitimization of ideology. Gandhi today is, of course, well embedded in the global discourse of sustainable development. His sense of continuity from personal to political has feminist resonance. His demasculinization is a model and his utopia worth struggling for. As a philosopher, I always find it difficult to place Gandhi. Does Gandhi qualify as a technical philosopher? My answer is ambivalent. But is there a Gandhian philosophy? Yes, there is. There is much good scholarship now, which is making Gandhi available philosophically. And I think that is extremely important. So we hope that now, as we enter the new age, we will have more and more opportunity to learn about Gandhi and I thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity to talk to you briefly with some of my views on Gandhi. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Rakesh Chandra, for caring to speak and also for setting the tone for this series of webinars that we have. Only Saturdays that we are meeting, next Saturday followed by Gandhi Jayanti Day. You are opening up a vast array of descriptions about various stages, beginning from education to his life in South Africa, then also Harijan, Young India, and his autobiography in 1925, connotations relating to Ahimsa and Satyagraha. Thank you very much for taking us through these various stages and, as usual, ending with the contemporary relevance also of various descriptions relating to feministic values that you have mentioned. These possibly have come as something new to us, the ones who have been participating in this for a short while now. Unlike the other webinars, where keynote is not open for discussion, we felt that this scholar, as a scholar who is into this field for quite a long time, is coming, and he would be with us for at least for 2 hours. Why not we have this keynote also been discussed? So I believe Professor Rakesh Chandra would be kind enough to respond to the queries and also the comments which would be made by the participants. Shall we welcome some questions? Would you be kind enough to answer them for at least for 15 minutes? Yes, if you agree to this, then kindly put up your hand, those who have some comments to make or some queries to be done, or put a request in the chat box to get our attention so that we would be able to call you, or you can even unmute yourself one by one and then come in. Shall I call upon Professor Anantagiri? Yes.
Thank you so much, Professor Rakesh Chandra and Saji and all dear friends. How are you, Professor Chandra?
Happy to see you after a long time.
We raise our hands in gratitude. I also recall our journey together from airport to Medical College. Thank you for your nurturance. Out of many issues that you have gifted us, one, for example, is the issue of prayer and how the whole Gandhi way of being with prayer, but both soulful and public.
Yes.
And I think that soulful public prayer is a very unique experiment of Gandhi. And I request you to kindly help us if there are genealogies of that, both in
Yes, I think there is some issues with the audio. I think it's clear, Professor Rakesh Chandra. I think you could hear him. Oh, yes.
Yeah, one small thing, I think, I just wanted to share this as my first thought, that, the idea of prayer.
May I
yes,
just with humility, just share one or two things quickly, so that I do not take much time. So this is one, that soulful public prayer also challenges us to rethink politics and public sphere. And today, what is happening in India and everywhere, and so this is my first thought. My second thought about Satyagraha as force, and in a sense of kind of a planetary mobilization of thinking and force. I'm thinking about Judith Butler, who interestingly has written very creatively about the women condition and also non-violence. So the force of non-violence in Butler and his idea of the feminine. What is very interesting is that the whole notion of the performative, and that performative as a condition for realization of potential. My humble submission is in what way we can bring Gandhi in conversation with thinkers and practitioners like Judith Butler.
What I think is that, when it comes to a real academic issue on Gandhi's idea of femininity, feminists, and the woman's body, as I mentioned that, as philosophers, we need to be philosophically analytical and critical. Gandhi, as I mentioned, wrote over a long period of time, and not every work of his can be considered to be, and not every action of his can be considered to be feminist. Also, but that he was sexist is also something which I do not want to agree to. He had deliberately, as I said, feminized his identity. Also, he thought that the idea of forbearance and the others is more appropriate to women, and so Satyagraha could be done that. At one time, he also said that, it would have been a great honor if I had been called the mother of the nation rather than the father, if I had exhibited those virtues. So he has these kinds of considerations. The other thing which I also say is that the idea of care ethics of Carol Gilligan, etc., can be brought in the understanding of Gandhi. But the idea of gender as performative, there is one person in India called Devika in Bangalore who has done on a work on Gandhi as a performer. But I find I have always found it a little awkward, because when we talk about performer, there is somehow or the other, to my mind, still a ring of faking it. Action is something which is deliberately done by some person with authenticity. So when you look at Hannah Arendt and look at the distinction between work, labor, and action, work is something which you do under the forces of necessity. Labor is something which you do under necessity. Work is something that you do to produce, and action is something which you do freely and dialogically. And performance, I don't know where does it fit in. The whole discussion of Judith Butler as of gender as performativity, in that, of course, Gandhi comes as a curious case of actually performing the full human self, not necessarily only the feminine self. And life-affirming idea is, of course, over there. In terms of, as you rightly mentioned, not only prayer, but everything as being a part of public scrutiny is something that Gandhi exposed himself to. So the personal as the political, that kind of a thing can be read into Gandhi. But the fact is, if you try to read scholarship and philosophical argumentation and feminist argumentation in Gandhi, you will have to construct it rather than find it.
Thank you so much, Professor Rakesh Chandra.
Thank you. I see Professor Alok Tandon's hand being raised. Would you come in, sir, please? Alok Tandon, Professor Alok Tandon.
Okay, thank you, Varghese. First of all, thank you to Professor Rakesh Chandra. I appreciate his contention that when we look at Gandhi, we should also look the influences, the Western influences on Gandhi, Plato, Tolstoy, Ruskin, Thoreau, because there is a move in our country to misappropriate Gandhian thought only in terms of Sanatana tradition, calling it the soul of India. So first of all, I must appreciate that. My question to Professor Rakesh Chandra is that you talked about the failure of Gandhi in dealing with Hindu-Muslim conflict. What about other failures? Did Gandhi not fail on the front of upper caste and scheduled caste, or you should say the issue of Dalits? And also, what about his critique of modernity? When you talk about globalization today, the globalization we know is an addition of capitalist modernity. So, how to deal with that in Gandhian terms with his critique in Hindu Swaraj? Thank you.
A 5/6. Yes. You want me to respond?
Yes, sir.
Hello?
Please go ahead.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you very much. I did mention, I think that Gandhi considered himself to be a failure, or a complete failure. He thought of himself as a failure in on every front. So it was not just that he was not able to reconcile the Hindus and the Muslims. He also thought of himself as a failure that he could not inspire in his own proteges against acceptance of mixed economy and capitalism. And so he did consider himself to be a grand failure. And that is why, as I mentioned early in life, when he wanted to live 120 years, towards the end, he wanted to die. He wanted to die. He was so despondent and so lonely. That flag post picture of his is actually the true picture of the way Gandhi saw himself, a flag post without the national flag, sitting under it in deep sorrow. While on the one hand, the people are wanting to appropriate Gandhi as part of the perennialists, from Huxley to the Indian version of the Sanatanis, there is also, I think, an equally troublesome idea that actually Gandhi was anti-Dalit, and then you only needed some other Columbia intellectuals to tell you about the Dalit story. I'm not at all excited by that, because that is funded by huge amount of thought and money, which I don't approve of. My own understanding is that he, in his own way, as I constantly said, is to be considered as human, not godly. He tried in his own way, thought, and that the appeal to the goodness of the human heart and the expansion of the human self would be more inclusive. And he constantly said that an independent India with untouchability is not something that he wants. And he constantly believed that he was a failure in that. He, in his own personal practice, as well as in his political ideals, as well as in his organization of people, he tried very much to do that. Did he succeed in that? Of course he did not. Did anyone else succeed in that? Nobody did.
Thank you very much for caring to answer those questions. Now, should I ask Professor Nicholas Geyer, would you like to make a comment on the keynote?
Thank you very much for your partial answer.
I will pass at the present time. Thank you for asking.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any more hands being raised, but there is something in the chat. I would like to read it out to you, Sir Rakesh. This is from Toli H. Kiba. Thank you, sir. Gandhi is not a feminist, but feminine. Thanks for the clarity. That's a comment. Would you like to say something on this?
I think I did mention this. I did mention this, that, you know, Gandhi feminized his identity, though calling him a certain kind of feminist, it will be troublesome. So I'm glad that she agrees with that. This is a very complex issue, and I think we have many things to discuss on this.
I don't see any more hands being raised. So,
may I ask another question?
Yes.
Varghese?
Please come in. Please come in. Yes. Please come in.
Yeah, actually, Rakesh ji also mentioned about the issue of culture, and I would like him to respond how Gandhi can be helpful in our present cultural scenario when we are talking a lot about glorification of our ancient culture.
Can I answer? I have, as I mentioned in the content of my paper, of my presentation, I did say that Gandhi has a great appreciation for people like Vivekananda and Sri Aurobindo. And if we were to take Sri Aurobindo a little seriously, he's very clear about three times of Indian culture: the suggestive period, or the earlier period of great inspiration. Then he talks about the search for dharma, and then he speaks about the time where the whole thing becomes declines and goes into authoritarianism and panditism. And he said that that is the time when Indian culture needed to renegotiate itself. That was the time of the European encounter, and that is the time when there were three reactions: one, to wholesale accept everything that the British said; two, to reject it; and three, then to creatively respond with the inborn Shakti. Now, Gandhi appreciates Aurobindo, and I think much of Gandhian spirit in the Aurobindo spirit, to my mind, would be this: that we take everything that is good in some of the ancient world and the great contributions made in terms of social and political organizations in the ancient republics, ancient kingdoms, ancient fortresses, ancient books, ancient philosophies, etc. But we also look at many of the shortfalls which needed correction. We look at the great questions that were raised by the Buddha, by Jyotirao Phule, by Pandita Ramabai Saraswati, raised by Kabir, by Nanak, by Tarabai Shinde. So we look at all of them as part of the whole process, which we call in the Indian philosophical tradition the process of Parishkar, Parimarjan, and Parivartan.
Dr. Ravichandran Murthy is the chairperson. He is an associate professor and former head of International Relations Research Cluster of Research Center for History, Politics and International Affairs, University of Kebangsaan, Malaysia. He teaches and researches in international relations, security, studies, and bioethics. He has a particular interest in Indian philosophy and ethics. He has written more than 100 academic works in numerous publications. He was appointed as Professor of Honor by Zhejiang Normal University, China in 2017 for his scholarly contributions to China's Belt and Road initiatives. He also serves as the adjunct professor of the American University of Sovereign Nations, United States. He is currently the president of the Asian Bioethics Association. He was appointed as visiting scholars to the Southeast Asia Studies Program, University of Puget Sound, Tacoma, United States, and a fellow of the Salzburg Global Seminar, Austria. He has consulted for many organizations, including the Institute of Diplomatic Studies, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, UNESCO, Bangkok, South Korean Embassy, and many Malaysian agencies. He has established wide networking with agencies throughout Asia Pacific and was invited as keynote speaker in many conferences worldwide. Your interest in South Asian studies is particularly of interest to us because our parent university here, NEHU, Northeastern Hill University, also has a South Asian Studies Center. We are fortunate to have you, sir, in our midst. May I welcome you to take the chair and kindly welcome our presenters.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Saji, for introducing me. I didn't expect that you will read my whole CV, but okay, anyhow, thank you. Thank you, everybody. Welcome to the second section, which is called the academic session. My name is Ravi. I'm from the National University of Malaysia. I teach international relations, but with a special interest in bioethics. So I'm quite active in the Asia Pacific Bioethics Network. So in that process, I got introduced to Indian ethics, Indian philosophy, and I've been in that Indian philosophy circle for some years now. And this is one of the books which I've published. I just want to show everybody. In 2018, I co-edited a book with Professor Panneerselvam, which is on conflict resolution, perspective from the Indian philosophy. And there is a chapter in that book on Gandhiism as well. So in preparation for this for this presentation, I was just reading and acquainting myself to what Gandhi has done and what Gandhi has said. Indeed, is a very interesting topic that we are discussing today, and especially not only in India but also world over. People who are interested in the Indian philosophy and the Gandhian perspective are enthralled to the idea not only on Indian spirituality but also on the expansion of that idea into other fields or other domains of discipline, including political science, social theories, and also, in fact, in international relations as well, as Gandhi is also regarded as a thinker in IR perspective, in that sense. With that, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to say something just before I introduce the speaker. Right, I prepared something here. As what the previous speaker, Dr. Rakesh, has very lucidly mentioned about the many facets of the Gandhian philosophy and the Gandhian ideology, both in terms of its supporters and also those in terms of his detractors, so to speak. And also the culmination of ideas and how these ideas has been developed in order to embrace different perspectives based on Gandhiji's experience and education, and also a real life experience, first being in South Africa, then later in India, and his own interaction with the colonial masters. So the Gandhian philosophy has an international effect to my mind. All right, the ideology is a collection of religious and social ideals that Gandhiji embraced. All right, he accepted, as well as he developed. Right, first in South Africa, then later in India, and also in the process of the Indian nationalism and the freedom movement. The Gandhian philosophy is not only political, but also it is a moral and religious at the same time. And it is also old, modern, simple, and yet complicated. It includes many of other Western ideas in which Gandhiji was exposed to, yet it is anchored in ancient Indian culture and employs universal moral and religious concepts. His thoughts reflects various levels of philosophy, from spirituality and religiosity, moral, political and statecraft, economic, all right, and also social, from Buddhism, from the Bible, from Gopalakrishna Gokhale, the ideas, Tolstoy, and of course the famous John Ruskin, and among others. So for him, the idea of spirituality, in a nutshell, was based on this concept of moral principle, as what Professor Saji mentioned in his opening remarks. As well as, if I could also include, it also includes the concept of moral reasoning, because he promoted the idea of self-exploration. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, with that short introduction to the topic, I would like to introduce our two eminent speakers today. All right, let me introduce both speakers first. All right, and I'll just simply read their short CVs. All right, then after that we will go for the presentation. Now, our first presenter is Professor Michael Myers. Professor Michael is a professor emeritus at the School of Politics, Philosophy, and Public Affairs, Washington State University. I believe I've also lectured at your university some years ago. He has published extensively in the field of spirituality sciences, Indian philosophy, and a host of, all right, who will be speaking on Gandhi, Jainism, and Ahimsa. Welcome, Prof.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me, and I appreciate very much a virtual visit to Shillong and the beautiful eastern provinces of India. So the discussion so far has been at a very high level. The keynote address by Professor Rakesh Chandra was very good. I learned a lot from that. And I would find it a little bit unnerving, actually, except for the fact that I perceive an authentic spirit of Satyagraha already in the conference. And as a person who wishes to grasp truth myself, I will try to add my own little contribution in my life. States at Charlottesville. He walked around with the people who were using Nazi symbols, and he was working for what he called American nationalism. He was a student in my class, so I had to deal with him on a day-to-day basis. He came to my office once and we were discussing some YouTube videos that he had been putting on. He was contesting some African-American students at nearby Gonzaga University about what's called here microaggressions, where African-American student would run into some sort of situation of prejudice or bias. And then the students at Gonzaga had compiled a list of these. This student thought that it was necessary for him to defeat, diffuse, and demean all of these different microaggressions. And I told him that I thought that that wasn't a good or useful project. Then I retired, he graduated, and recently I find that he's one of the two principals on a podcast called Fash the Nation. He has gone totally over to anti-Semitism. He's gone over to the hate that produces so much trouble here in the United States and abroad. And so as I make my argument in my paper, which is an argument for toleration and for holding open a diversity of views, the Jains divide all things into living, jiva, and non-living, ajiva. The principle of life is distinct from the body and is the soul. The sense organs are like windows for the soul to use to look beyond the body. The soul can be directly perceived by introspection without a strong concept of God. The Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, and the Quran are all texts that relate God's will to human practice and behavior in powerful ways. Others, non-theists or those outside theistic traditions, tend to distrust the argument that morality depends on belief in God. They point to the fact that many religious people have a poor record of ethical behavior, and that religion continues to be a source of violence and oppression in the world. The atheist view sometimes lacks precision, but atheists have a point. If religion is oriented entirely towards God in an afterlife, then this world loses importance. If this world becomes a bare shadow of the next, then the ways we comport ourselves in relation to the world, to one another, other creatures, and the environment may become demeaned in favor of the value of an ideal relationship to God. The characteristics specified in the relationship to God may be full of good, but there remains a danger that they might become ungrounded in practice. In the 1996 Indian film Fire, for example, a husband believes so much in the value of celibacy that he forces his wife to sleep with him while withholding all intimacy from her. The marriage was celibate for 13 years. The husband believed that passing a test that evidenced his control of sexual desire was more important than anything his partner may have needed or felt. The film shows that harm toward others may sometimes take a psychological form or even a form of non-action rather than overt violent behavior. The example shows that ethics may actually increase in importance for people who remain this worldly rather than turning solely toward another world. Following an otherworldly ideal is no guarantee that one will orient oneself toward this world in an ethical way. Jainism provides an interesting example of a religion that is largely non-theistic, yet centrally concerned with ethics. Jains hold that Ahimsa is the umbrella virtue that binds the whole series of other virtues together. Ahimsa is literally non-killing, and by extension, it means non-harming and non-violence. Most commentators consider Ahimsa to include a ban on mental as well as overt physical violence as hopelessly relativistic. Others have defended its coherence and insight. The philosopher Jain Vada. Motilal notes favorably that Jain philosophy has been called. In characterizing the Jain position, Motilal writes, "The idea is not that we can identify some elements of reality as substance and others as process or paryaya. Rather, the claim is that the same element has both characteristics alternatively and even simultaneously." Motilal sees the Jains as offering a bivalent logic of precarious values and a challenge to the law of non-contradiction. Anikantavada is not skepticism because the Jains assert the manifoldness of reality non-skeptically. It is not dogmatism, although Motilal notes that the Jains were pretty dogmatic about non-dogmatism. Motilal admits that when we look at the Jain view, we find the reflexes of relativism are unmistakable. But he notes that this is also true of many modern writers. He cites Nelson Goodman's The Ways of World Making as an example. In that book, Goodman argues for the existence of many worlds. One criticism of relativism is that in trying to argue that every truth is relative to some perspective, one must presuppose a notion of absolute truth. Motilal notes that the Jains freely admit an absolute notion of truth, which lies in the total integration of all partial or conditionally arrived at truths. The emphasis is on practical human fallibilism, on the conditionality and limitedness of human power and human vision, and on the fallibility of all humanly constructed positions. Motilal writes, "The concern is somewhat ethical. Rejection of a seriously held view is discouraged lest we fail to comprehend its significance and underlying presuppositions and assumptions." Here, Motilal makes the connection between standpoints and Ahimsa explicit. The call to action is that we ought not to reject other people's views outright because we may lack an understanding of the view's place in the larger conceptual scheme of the other person, and we may not see the presuppositions and assumptions that have led the person to accept the view. Motilal thus points to an ethical corollary, and indeed in Jainism we find the ethical imperative that one ought not to harm. Non-harming arises from a prohibition on killing living beings, but its application to the context of intellectual debate has been widely accepted in the modern period. In other words, we ought to grant the perspectival truth of the opinions of people who hold beliefs and practices different from our own, and we ought to do so with a view to the connection between intellectual respect and physical non-harming. A lack of intellectual respect may devolve into charged polemics, which themselves may transform into a set of beliefs that one's opposite number, the other, is unworthy even of life or limb. This particular form of the argument for nonviolence arises from the insight that attachment to intellectual positions can breed suffering. The Jain philosopher Haribhadra, 700 to 770, writes, "Those great graspers at unprofitable argument due to pride and ignorance should be renounced by those desirous of liberation. In reality, those desirous of liberation should have no attachment to grasping anywhere. There's a story about Haribhadra that when young, he debated some Buddhist monks. After he had defeated them, he angrily ordered them to jump into a vat of hot oil. Haribhadra's teacher ordered him to undertake severe penance for his anger and attachment to his own ideas. From the Jain point of view, there are two reasons why one should remain non-attached to one's ideas. In the first place, one may fail to take into account the many possible perspectives from which a proposition may be validly asserted. Moreover, as Haribhadra learned from his own life experience, one may also run the risk of arousing unwanted passions such as competitiveness, defensiveness, and anger in oneself. These reasons lead to further enmeshing in the process of birth, death, and rebirth. With this argument in mind, one might argue that the Jain philosophy of standpoints leads directly to an ethic of intellectual ahimsa. In his 2009 book, Jainism: An Introduction, Jeffrey Long responds to this conclusion from two perspectives, one historical and the other philosophical. He notes first that in historical terms, one must acknowledge that Jain writers were sharp polemicists. Haribhadra's admonition against attachment to ideas is an exception to the polemical style of much of Jain writing. Long suggests that it might be the case that intellectual ahimsa is a modern interpretation, and that in early Jainism there was never an explicit connection between nonviolence and the conceptual relativity of standpoints. Long suggests further that an examination of the Jain theory of error might help determine what the traditional texts entail. The Jains were definitely inclusivists in that they believed that Jainism included the sum total of truths taught by all contemporary systems of thought, such as Buddhism and Vedanta. Ambiguity remains, however, in regard to whether the Jains understood Buddhism and Vedanta as limited perspectives or as fallacious philosophies. Some highly charged polemical passages would seem to imply the latter. The Jain writer Hemachandra, for example, wrote a text entitled Anya Yoga Vyavachedaka, which might be translated the ripper apart of other systems of thought or other paths of thought. Motilal interprets the Jains as holding a more accepting view when he writes, I think the Jains carried the principle of nonviolence to the intellectual level and thus propounded their Anikanta doctrine. Thus, the hallmark of the Anikanta doctrine was toleration. Just one more page, okay? The principle embodied in the respect for the life of others was transformed by the Jain philosophers at the intellectual level into respect for the views of others. Motilal explicitly connects the doctrine of the relativity of viewpoints with ahimsa. Long points out that Motilal has provided no textual evidence from pre-modern Jain writings that connect conceptual relativism with tolerance and nonviolence. However, some have tried to make the connection between intellectual ahimsa and nonviolence. Although it's unclear that the Jains had nonviolence in mind when they propounded the doctrine of conceptual relativity, it is still useful for us today to uncover the logical connection. Long follows Gandhi in extending the doctrine of anikanta to include multiple examples of modern pluralism in religious texts such as the Bhagavad Gita, the Bible, the Quran, and in Thoreau, Tolstoy, and Theosophy. Gandhi used all of these to inform his worldview. Gandhi was himself called an anikantavadi, literally a follower of non-one-sidedness, and a sadvadi, a follower of the school of perhaps, both terms coming from Jain philosophy. Gandhi was born and raised in Gujarat, an area of India that contains a large concentration of Jains. Jains were frequent visitors to the Gandhi household. The young Mohandas took a view of abstinence from alcohol, meat eating, and sexual activity, a vow administered by a Jain monk shortly before he embarked for London to study law. After returning, Gandhi had the Jain teacher Rajachandra Maheta as close friend and spiritual advisor. Gandhi accepted the labels of Anikantavadi and Sadvadi, but realized that his use of these ancient doctrines was a modern philosophical adaptation. He was challenged in a letter to his newspaper, Young India, in late 1925 or 1926. The writer pointed out that while Gandhi self-consciously accepted Advaita Vedanta as his personal philosophy, Gandhi also spoke and wrote frequently about a personal God. Common knowledge holds that there is little place for a personal God in Advaita, given its view that the world is irreducibly one and impersonal Brahman. Only a Dvaitin, a dualist, could remain a Vedantin and hold a concept of a personal God. Gandhi responded to the letter in quintessential standpoint fashion. He wrote, "I am an Advaitist and yet I support Dvaitism. The world is changing every moment and is therefore unreal. It has no permanent existence. But though it is constantly changing, it has something about it which persists and is to that extent real." Here, Gandhi gives a straightforward defense of opposite views from the perspective of multiple standpoints. His thinking follows the form of the example of a clay pot, where the clay endures or has being, while the shape of the pot lacks being. Gandhi adapted the Jain doctrine and gave it a practical application in his own time and place. Long concludes, from Gandhi's perspective, it was Jain philosophy that allowed him to exercise not only tolerance, but empathy for the position of those with whom he disagreed. Conclude in paragraph. Gandhi serves an example of a philosopher and an activist who practiced ahimsa both as an intellectual and practical virtue, both in civil discourse and as a matter of preserving life. Although the connection between the doctrine of standpoints and the doctrine of non-harming is somewhat murky in the history of Jain texts, thinkers like Gandhi, Motilal, and Long have shown that the two doctrines are mutually implicative in the logical sense. The ability to place oneself in the shoes of the other is a necessary condition for peaceful discourse and the flourishing of practical life. Ahimsa, on the other hand, is necessary in order to establish a peaceful form of life in which diverse opinions freely flow. The middle term, which is the term we need to supply in interpreting the Jain text correctly, is intellectual ahimsa, that is, ahimsa applied to ideas. Ahimsa provides the logical connection between physical nonviolence and a world of diverse views. That is not to say that all words or manners of speech or domains of discourse are tolerable. The specification of intolerable forms of speech or domains is a difficult project, but a primary criterion of such a project is whether or not the speech conforms to ahimsa in the widest sense of non-harming. If an argument is given in good faith, or as Motilal states, if it is seriously held, it must be examined. The conclusions of even the best arguments are tentative. A pernicious argument is rightly ripped apart, but a serious search for the perspective of its maker must be formed concurrently.
Thank you very much, Professor Myers, for a very thought-provoking presentation. A lot of information and also perspective was discussed. I will not belabor further because we will be going to the during the Q&A session. We will revisit the points that Professor Myers has mentioned. Now, I would like to invite the second speaker now. Our second speaker today is Dr. Prasenjit Biswas from the Department of Philosophy, Northeastern Hill University, Shillong, right? And he will be speaking on Gandhigiri as a way of life, Swaraj of the mind. I would like to invite the good professor, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a privilege to speak amongst these learned scholars because it's a kind of international gathering which is trying to reflect on Gandhi's philosophy in relation to politics and also the overall point of view of Gandhi. As the previous speaker pointed out, several things. In fact, the whole epistemological and the metaphysical paradigm, which is there in Gandhi, is partly decoded by my previous speaker, and I laud and agree to most of it that he had said. Suffices to say that for me, for my present purpose, that Gandhi did a kind of a creative hermeneutics of Indian philosophical traditions. But for Gandhi, Indian philosophical traditions were in an interface with other Western traditions as well. And this interface between the Indian philosophical traditions and the Western way of reasoning or rationalization through Indian philosophical standpoints is all the time taking one to a certain mode of practice. Now, practice is something that arises in the specific Indian cultural and political context, which draws its entire inspiration from a certain philosophical tradition, which was in the need of an interpretation for supplicating the need of the time. Now, Ashish Nandi, in his Intimate Enemy, that could be a good beginning point of discussion to talk about Gandhi's hermeneutics, where Ashish Nandi is explicating Gandhi's point of view as an attempt of decolonization of the Indian philosophical traditions. Now, by decolonization of the Indian philosophical traditions, what Gandhi meant is a new conception of self in relation to the emerging forms of others and the experiences of otherness, which are not necessarily embodied either by the self or by the other. So a notion of self that comprises of disembodied others in an experience of otherness, was the very basis of Gandhian reinterpretation of Indian philosophical traditions. Now, this domain of otherness, where self as a subject is located, where the other as a different subject is located, and where by dissolving this binary between the self and the other, there is an experience of otherness, is all captured by Gandhi's notion of, a variety of notions rather, that Gandhi threw up. One of the very important notion that Gandhi threw up is what Gandhi called as anashakti, what Gandhi called it oparigraha. Now, anashakti is that kind of a transformation of the soul, which again, in a traditional Jaina sense, a soul is a repository of the karman. Now, Gandhi wanted to take the discourse of soul out of the bounds of karma. So Gandhi wanted to take soul directly to the level of an epistemic agency, to the level of a caregiving agency, to the level of the possibility of a transpositional subjectivity that can put itself in the shoe of the other. So in a sense, Gandhi dissolved this binary between jiva and ajiva. Gandhi dissolved this binary between jiva and dharma. And by way of dissolving this binary between jiva and dharma, Gandhi also dissolves this categorical distinction between dharma and adharma. Now, this is something very, very radical for Gandhi to do so, because it radically questions the very premises of the ethics of liberation that Indian philosophy hitherto talked about in terms of self-purification, in terms of assuming the right faith, right knowledge, right conduct as pathways towards moksha. Now, for Gandhi, right faith, right knowledge, and right conduct are connected to an evolved form of practice, and it's not the received form of practice. Now, this is where the boundary between dharma and adharma gets dissolved, and it takes a different shape altogether in the form of understanding the very nature of truth, which Gandhi had understood as something divested of the karma meta, divested of the longevity determining, the body making, the status determining, and many other such kinds of obstructive or obstructional nature of the self. So this obstructional nature of the self is turned into a constructivist epistemic agency of practicing a certain way, not necessarily subscribing to a notion of liberation in the form of self-purification, rather throwing it in the open towards what Gandhi thought to be an experience of otherness. So how did Gandhi throw it open to the experience of otherness? In fact, Gandhi's interpretation of Shadharma, which apparently means the dharma of the self, is something very different from a traditional interpretation of Shadharma in opposition to Paradharma. Gandhi never thought that Shadharma is something that has to be preferred over Paradharma. Nor Gandhi thought that Paradharma also could be a kind of a conscious choice over Shadharma. Indeed, Gandhi wanted to resolve this binary between Shadharma and Paradharma, again, in a new construction of an epistemic agency that reconstitutes the very notion of truth. Now, truth for Gandhi, as the previous professor mentioned, is partly Gandhi's practice of Shayadavada. And we know that Gandhi was a perspectivalist and a Shayadavadin, which brings him very close to understanding the temporal character of human practices, or rather the broader human condition in which the spectre of otherness is disclosed or appears on the horizons of knowledge and understanding. So therefore, Gandhi's idea of decolonization is to dissolve the conceptual binaries that are available in the Indian tradition, the conceptual binary that obstructs us from moving between Shadharma and Paradharma, or coming back from Paradharma to Shadharma, or from moving from Shadharma to Paradharma. Each of these moves could be not just a passive movement, but these moves are dharmic movement. They are not karmic movement. The possibility of dharmic movement by dissolving the boundaries, the conceptual distinctions, and the obstructions that arise from the smallish finitude of human existence in terms of embodiment, in terms of end-mindedness, in terms of end-worldliness. All this bounds for Gandhi were a certain kind of an obstruction that needed to be overcome by practicing a newly constituted notion of truth, which I am going to explicate in a moment, is very different from the way Gandhi has been perceived in India as well as in the West. Gandhi, as everyone agrees, doesn't believe in any doctrinaire notion of non-violence, a truth. Gandhi's truth is experimental. It's an experiment with oneself that requires a dynamic, changing notion of self, which is again a notion of dharma. And this notion of dharma is not the notion of the purusharthic dharma. It's not a notion of the karmic dharma. It's not a notion of the paramarthic dharma. It's not a notion of the pratibhashika dharma. So dharma without the attributes, essential and advantageous attributes of dharma. So dharma, which is entirely open to the fluctuating moments of sayada, dharma that is incipient, dharma which is in a constant process of emergence and which recreates and deconstructs and recreates the very epistemic relationship between the self and the world, the ethical relationship between the self and the other. So therefore, dharma is only a certain kind of a movement, and there is no control of this movement. It's not the self as an agent who controls this movement. It's also not a movement which is predetermined. It's a kind of, I would say, an indeterminate, inexpressible type of a movement that determines a non-purusharthic, a non-paramarthic, a non-attached notion of dharma. In the sense of non-attachment, the kind of dharma that is prescribed, the prescriptive character of dharma is also overcome by Gandhi's non-prescriptive mode of dharma, which is entirely experiential and experimental. For Gandhi, it is all the time reshaping, reconfiguring an idea of oneself, which is not pinned on the given notion of self, which Ramchandra Gandhi very categorically called as a notion of thou, as a notion of you, as a pronominal. Gandhi constructs the notion of the self, which is never a nominal, which is never the embodied, which is never the encoded and worded and minded kind of a self. The moment such a self is thought about, which is encoded and minded, is a bounded notion of the self, which has to solicit some way of liberating itself. Then that kind of a self becomes a burden on oneself. But if one can give up that kind of a karmic notion of self, and one approaches or accepts a dharmic notion of self, which is spanned on a domain of indeterminate, non-apprehensible sense of otherness, in which the other is also not a bounded other. So neither the bounded self, nor the bounded other, nor this bounded sphere of human relation, rather exploring the sphere of relationality in dharmic terms by dissolving the adharmic obstructions that could have come into it, is a truly liberating spirit that Gandhi had created. And this truly liberating spirit of Gandhi manifests itself in the work of Gandhigiri. And what is the basic work of Gandhigiri? The basic work of Gandhigiri is to stand apart, watch, and also to create an alternative epistemic standpoint over and against a case of oppression, over and against a case of discrimination, over and against a case of a deliberate differentiation with the other. So in relation to the other, Gandhigiri stands out as an alternative epistemic stance, an alternative epistemic stance that could be practiced into the lives of others, provided others emulate it, provided others are ready to accept it. So Gandhi posed that kind of a challenge, which could be called as the challenge of Gandhigiri to all those who were creating artificial conditions of dehumanization, of repression, of arbitrary kinds of discrimination, of violence, of victimization, and all such pathologies, all such implications of a certain kind of an aggression, injury, or violence that is committed on other people. So Gandhi wanted to create an alternative standpoint that is self-illuminating, self-luminous, and that poses a stiff challenge to the presuppositions of all kinds of symbolic and real violences that are committed on other people. So Gandhigiri, as a stance, is opposed to caste oppression. It's opposed to oppression of women. It's opposed to oppression of poor. So Gandhigiri is, when I say Gandhigiri is opposed to, it means Gandhigiri evolves a certain stance in terms of its epistemic and practical capacities or capabilities to stand apart from the scene of oppression and to try and modify and transform the scene of oppression by way of a transposition of that position of Gandhigiri into the scene. And one example of this Gandhian practice is Gandhi's, in a sense, silent boycott of when India was becoming free on 15th August of 1947. And Gandhi's great-grandson, Tushar Gandhi, this year had pointed out that Gandhi was spending time in Calcutta slums by talking to absolutely plebeian, marginalized people who were just huddled together in shanties, in slums, without much amenities to live, without much food to eat, or without even clean water, who were confronting life at that moment of 15th August with all the filth, dirt, and all kinds of regressive ideas about others all around. And Calcutta was just trying to recuperate itself from the mayhem that went on since 1946, from the direct action day to the day of independence and beyond. And Gandhi wanted to create an enlightening atmosphere for all those sufferers, for the victims, and all those who were ready to take part in further mayhem and target other people. Gandhi stood in between the targets and the persecutors. Gandhi stood in between those who are marginalized and left out by the colonial rule of 200 years and the wearing out, fading colonial rule. So Gandhi somewhere stood in between the two worlds and kept them separate. When Gandhi kept them separate, Gandhi created a possibility of the persecutor and the tormentor to go off from the sin, and at the same time live the sin, widen the space for the oppressed, for the poor, for the victimized, and for those who have been kept out of the funfair that was going on elsewhere in the name of celebrating independence of India. So this is what Gandhigiri means. It's an effective way of restraining violence. And it's also a very creative way of opening up a new space of coming together of a variety of people, a new space of rebuilding solidarity, lost solidarity among peoples who have been disengaged from each other, except in the cases of being violently targeting each other. So Gandhi understood this grim social reality, or rather the political reality of violence, and Gandhi created an alternative standpoint or a platform which could be passed off now in the name of Gandhigiri. Now, Gandhi advocated a kind of non-violent resistance Now, non-violent resistance can assume a number of symbolic ways. And one of the symbolic ways by which non-violent resistance can take place is by way of allotting the violator, the tormentor, or the persecutor about the possibility of love, the possibility of truth, the possibility of affection, the possibility of thinking differently. How the persecutor could be transformed, how the hurts of persecutor could be won, is a difficult challenge before a man like Gandhi, who wanted to free the world from violence. And therefore, Gandhi all the time found, rather evolved or innovated a creative way in allowing the set of persecutors and the violators not to commit these acts of abysmal, reprehensible kinds of wrong action on other people. And this Gandhi did by way of sensitizing them. So sensitizing people who are involved in wrong deeds. It's not just penalizing, it's sensitizing and arousing the feeling of goodness back, which is a kind of a therapeutic impact, which is a kind of self-healing that Gandhi wanted these people to practice. It is a certain kind of degeneration of the psychological state that creates this obsessive, neurotic forms of violence, which requires an immediate self-curing, or some kind of restraint, which creative ways of Gandhi's sensitization had successfully brought back among the persecutors and the offenders, because Gandhi demonstrated a certain way of creating, bridging up a kind of an agape, a new kind of love between those who have fallen apart. So Gandhigiri is to reinstitute the lost solidarity in the acts of public loving, in the acts of public empathizing, in the acts of public dissolving of the binary opposition between a side A and a side B. What could be the best practice of Satyagraha? And this is how you can evolve a pluralistic practice of truth. You see the truth from the point of view of tormentor. You heal the tormentor's truth to bring it to the level of those victims and oppressed people's truth that widens and humanizes tormentors' notion of truth into a more human notion of truth. So it is a rediscovery of the human that Gandhigiri tries to attain. And this is something more dharmic any day than the Purusharthik Dharma or Paramarthik Dharma. So Dharma gets entirely translated into Gandhi's act of Gandhigiri. And such acts of Gandhigiri creates a kind of a prospective courage of truth, as Gandhi would love to call it, which Gandhi named as Satyagraha, which is not to get attached into a scenario of violence by taking side, but to extricate the parties involved in a conflict to a commonly acceptable, shareable notion of truth, a truth that sort of carries the perspective of both the sides who are engaged in violence. And therefore, Gandhi advocated a lot of intercultural dialogue, a lot of interreligious dialogue. And Gandhi was advocating that prayers, Hindu prayers, must happen in the mosques, and Islamic prayers must happen in the temples. At the height of Noakhali riot onwards, all these riots that followed, which led to the partition of India on the basis of an imagined two-nation theory, Gandhi created an alternative plan of praying, and Gandhi continued with his prayers. Gandhi invited people to join in his prayers, and by praying, Gandhi found a way of a certain kind of a certain therapeutic way of clearing out much of the obsessive neurotic processes of the human mind, which required a certain kind of healing, certain kind of curing, which Gandhi could do by way of his prayer, which is part of his Gandhigiri. Now, all this practical action that Gandhi took also results into a certain idea of self and the other. The best possible idea that emanates from Gandhi's way of removing the tendentiousness, removing the obsessive neurotic state to a state of tranquility, to an ataraxic state where one can see oneself in peace with oneself, in joy with oneself, and one has a kind of an illuminating self-knowledge in oneself, is creating a new set of internal relations of being in oneself, which Gandhi's ways of curing, healing, practicing creates in an individual, and which can be easily transposed, which can be easily transported to another, which could be communicated to another by way of being an example of such ataraxic, such a parigraha, such an ashakta kind of a self that one is trying to manifest in oneself. So therefore, Gandhi or Gandhigiri leads to a certain elevation of the soul, a certain elevation of the mind, in recreating a new sense of self. Now, this new sense of self, Gandhi called this as Swaraj, and this Swaraj is something like when one's faith increases. Swaraj is something like when one trusts increases. Swaraj is something like when one is able to part with what one has for the other. So Swaraj is this quintessential act of giving care to the other, giving love to the other. Now, this reshaping of the human relation, this remodulation of the human emotions can create a different sense of experiential truth, which Gandhi liked to call as rule by the self, rule of the self. It's not just a self-rule in a political sense, but it's more a kind of a cultural self-rule, where as a community of individuals, the community is able to create a sense of freedom, a sense of creative healing of its own pain, pangs, angst, and anxieties, which are all stored in the collective mind or in the collective sense of identity. So therefore, Gandhi was able to create two different kinds of selves, a self which is healed and a self that is prior to the process of healing. If these two selves can come together, then it is possible to think about a kind of Swaraj at the collective level, at the communal level, such that such Swaraj committed individuals can join up to a community of Swarajists, a community of Swarajists who enjoy a certain kind of cultural freedom, who breaks through this nexus of oppression or this nexus of power relations, so that one can all the time transpose oneself to the shoes of the other in order to establish what one missed out by way of distancing oneself and by way of a plan or a scheme to injure the other in order to settle a certain score that arose from misapprehension of reality in terms of one's own narrow self-interest. So what Gandhi is trying to do here is to reignite a certain kind of a passion for love, a passion for truth. And this reignition of the passion ties together number of selves to come to a community. And this is what could be best described as Kalidas Bhattacharya once described it as, Swaraj in ideas. I would like to call it Swaraj of the mind. Why mind? Because primarily Gandhi is trying to ignite a collective mind, which earlier failed to cognitively perceive how it is getting mired into a certain kind of conflict. To alleviate that involvement, to elevate from that involvement in a conflict, and to recreate and reignite a passion for loving the other in the public by way of bringing together, by way of giving a lot of care, and not just by way of giving reasons in a cut and dry fashion, or not just by creating a different public discourse in a discursive sense, but in the sense of practicing love, practicing open-heartedness, having a kind of an open heart to embrace the other with all the differences and limitations, and at the same time trying to heal what has gone wrong between oneself and another, is reignition of a mind, which is its initial condition of this great possibility of transforming a conflicted community or a divided house. Now, Gandhi has been very, very careful about this kind of a possibility, and he would say that our personal conduct should be such that that it becomes, an example or a policy for a group or a community or a nation. Now, in the manner in which Gandhi is saying this, personal conduct is also interpersonal. It is not just impersonal, it is interpersonal. It's an interpersonal conduct towards arriving at a collective notion of truth. And that is what is a certain gearing up of one's own soul to a sense of freedom and to a new sense of freedom. And therefore, Gandhi would say that a non-violent individual is a reality. And if a non-violent individual is a reality, a non-violent state can also come into existence. And this non-violent state will not distinguish between its citizens and its subjects, which is also very, very relevant for Gandhi at this point of time, because citizens who are supposed to be citizens of a free country, a country which is born after 1947, but at the same time, a country which is ripped apart by social and cultural divisions, creating different subjectivities and group subjectivities, mired into all kinds of conflicts and possibilities of multiplication of such conflicts, gives rise to the possibility of creating an alternative way of loving and caring, which is a certain kind of an extension of oneself. Gandhi would say it's a certain kind of an akasha. We project ourselves in the akasha, in that extended realm where we are not bound by our body and the mind, but we have this possibility of an eternal and also a passive movement towards the other. It's not a kind of a enforced or a forced movement that goes beyond our voluntariness, but it must be voluntarily arising from oneself in order to create a new sense of solidarity. And this is a kind of an akasha, which is something ontologically available for all of us to expand ourselves, to extend ourselves. And this can happen only when one is free of the karmic impressions. And to be free of the karmic impressions, one has to not only go by the existing categories of citizens, but one has to look at certain other categories that our category of citizen doesn't really include within the scope of the political society. And in order to broaden the scope of the political society, Gandhi would say that this kind of a move cannot be entirely driven by the elites. Rather, it should be driven by a sense of what is wrong a sense of what is shameful or humiliating for all of us, which arises from not just humiliation of mind, but it also arises from when I feel humiliated by seeing humiliation of someone else. Gandhi would argue this. Now, this capacity to see the injury in someone else, the capacity to see the humiliation of someone else, is something that could be evoked only by way of a voluntary understanding of the situation. It cannot be evoked by an external force, by a law, by a state, or a governing machinery. But it can all be collectively shared in the acts of Gandhigiri, such as prayer. So therefore, Gandhigiri has this immense possibility of leading us to a different sense of Swaraj of the mind. And this idea needs to be explored in terms of this ongoing process of decolonization of the mind that Gandhi initiated, which still needs to be practiced in the public life in which we are engaged with on a variety of issues, on a variety of matters of concerns. I think I'll close here with this. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, can you hear me?
Hello.
Hello, yeah. Mr. Chairman. Sure.
Thank you so much, Professor Bishwas. Very insightful, thought-provoking, and also challenging proposition from you. Challenging the very notion of Dharma, as what you mentioned, Gandhi was trying to recreate and to reconstruct. All right, as an entity which is constantly moving, all right, which is non-prescriptive. And you also mentioned a lot of things that how Gandhiji looked at the whole concept of Dharma and the proposition as it carries. We will straight away go to the question and answer session. For the discussion session, that is. We have about 25 minutes, about 20 minutes before we conclude the session. I would like to invite the panel, the audience today. You can put up your hand. I can see Miss Goyal here. Shamiksha Goyal has already put up your hand. Okay, fine. And two ways that you can put up your hand and put up your hand, not physically, but also there is a tab, right, that you can raise your hands and also open your, video, so that we will know that it is somebody is talking, somebody is asking a question. Or you can leave your question in the chat box, then I can also ask the question on behalf. So at the moment, I think the first question comes from Madam Samiksha Goyal. Please go ahead, sir, Madam.
Thanks, Dr. Ravi. Joseph Campbell put up his hand before me, but I hope it's okay, Joe, if I go first.
Yes. Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah. All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Bishash, and thanks, Professor Myers, as well for your presentation. My question right now is to Professor Myers, and we can then follow up. I had a couple of questions. One of them is this more textual question, because I'm also interested in reading Gandhi and his reflections on Jainism. Briefly, you spoke about yoga and different interpretations of yoga, knowledge, faith, cessation. I was just interested to know, could you also come across views which were connecting yoga and Ahimsa? Because, but my first question, the textual question, is more of this, that could you come across things which were connecting yoga and Ahimsa for Gandhi as well as for Jainas? And my second question is more conceptual, and that is about Anikantavada, Syadvada, and Gandhi's take on it. So from as far as I understand Gandhi's notion of truth, and even if we take Gandhi's notion of Satyagraha, there's this very strong notion of conviction. And if you also look at his political radicalism, it has a lot to do with being very convinced about your understanding in your quote unquote point of view. And that for Gandhi is definitely truth. With this, how does he bring together this idea of perspectivalism or possible relativism that comes in with Anikantavada? Like that tension, I'm really confused about and want to take an understanding on that. So yeah, these two questions from me. Sorry if they were long. Thank you.
So they're very good. Just give me 1 second. I need to fetch a book. 1 second.
Oh.
Perhaps while waiting for Professor Myers, Professor Bishwas, you'd like to respond to a question?
Okay. I mean, I'll have a very brief response to this question because
Yes.
I won't give a textual response, but I would simply point out that Gandhi's notion of truth is context invariant, and it's a kind of pan-rational notion of truth. As I said, that it projects it in a domain of otherness. And this projection to the domain of otherness is something that Swaraj implies. Swaraj is this extension, extended intentionality, moving beyond a fixed notion of truth, whereby Shayadabada can really happen, so that things simultaneously exist and not exist. That which not exists comes into existence, and that which exists can go out of existence. And that's the Gandhian intervention. And therefore, it's possible to have a certain kind of internal realism along with perspectivism, in Gandhi, where bivalence, true or false, is not very important. And that's how Gandhi crosses these boundaries that are usually posited between dharma and adharma. If Professor Myers has come, the question was to him. Yeah.
Okay. Yes. The textual question, I think I can resolve that by giving you the source of where I found the Jain theory of yoga. And that was in Dasgupta's multi-volume history of Indian philosophy, volume 1. So that's quite different from Patanjali yoga or other forms of yoga. It's a wider sense of yoga as the Jain sort of religious practice. And so I think that at the beginning of Professor Bishwa's talk, he did a very nice job sort of showing how Gandhi, in providing what Professor Bishwas called a decolonization of the Indian philosophical tradition or a hermeneutic of the Indian traditions, he showed that we might say that Gandhi almost played a little fast and loose with some of the philosophical materials that he was working with. And so his conception of yoga, I think, differs perhaps quite a bit from the Jain use of that term as kind of the whole religious practice. So that's what I would point to as at least the beginning to the textual problem. Now, the second question, which was longer, having to do with perspectivalism and truth, is a little trickier. I don't think I want to sort of come out with a definitive answer to that. I would just want to say that relativism, I don't think is, there's not a pernicious relativism that is implied in Gandhi's thinking. And I don't think even in Jainism, it's difficult to, I don't know, maybe it has to do with the concept of the self. I think that's what Professor Biswas also went to that a little bit, saying that the locus of truth or grasping truth in the self is such that it's a kind of practical experience in the living out of life. And it may not be theoretically so clear, how we're going to solve the issue of different people having different perspectives and there being a truth that we would want to say is realist that exists out there in the world. The problem as I see it is really made more difficult by the example I gave at the very beginning of my talk, and that is a person like my former student who uses hip and rhetorical language that can be very popular among his listeners to promulgate hate and all kinds of bizarre opinions about race and Jewish people and people of color and all the kinds of issues that are in front of us so strongly today. I like to make a distinction between rabble rousers and people who are holding serious opinions and giving an argument. So at my conclusion, what I wanted to say was that we have to accept that as an argument from anyone, but we have the right to demolish that argument. And we also have a right to not accept the unthoughtful opinions that are expressed in non-argumentative form as simple polemics out in the public square or on social media or something like that. I don't know, does that help at all?
Yeah, it does. Can I go on with follow-ups, Dr. Ravi, here?
Yes, but kindly make it short.
Yeah, I'll try. Yeah, quickly. So I was also trying to put together the ideas of intellectual humility and tolerance, and this idea of possible criticism of these kind of views, because Gandhi would very strongly criticize a person's practice, like your previous student, and he would strongly be against anti-Semitic views, racial views, and things like that. So that's one thing there again that we might want to a very convinced criticism he would give, and that again needs a notion of truth. And truth here, by truth, I really don't mean a realistic truth, an objective truth of the scientific kind. Not at all, because for Gandhi, truth would be a very experiential matter. What might help here, what I've been recently looking at is something like what Williams or Samuel Scheffler calls a personal point of view. And they would want that. Something like that could be more Gandhian in terms of having that point of view, but having a very convinced point of view as well. So personal point of view possibly gives you this leeway for bringing in tolerance, and yet there's this conviction there. So, I mean, these two parts, I was just wondering.
I like that a lot. When you said that Gandhi would be very much against the kinds of words that my former student was saying, that reminded me of the Jain example I gave, where the guy was the ripper apart of the opposing views. A strong polemical argument isn't necessarily or essentially a bad argument or a hateful argument. So I think that drawing from those two sources that you're suggesting is a very good idea.
All right. Thank you so much. That was very helpful. And thank you, Dr. Bishash. That was also very helpful.
Thank you. Can we go to the second question, please? It was Joseph Campbell.
Sorry. You know, I'm wondering, a lot of what Samiksha just asked, I was going to ask, but I guess to follow up on that, I guess one thing I'm kind of struggling with the view that Samiksha's suggesting there for Gandhi is it an epistemic view? It is a view of truth. And it gets back to the question of like struggling with whether Gandhi's a value monist or a value pluralist. There's a sense in which I think he's got to be a value monist. But so is it proper to just say that it is yeah, I don't know. I wonder if you could kind of close that gap for me a little bit more. And actually, I'll extend this question to both of the speakers. In fact, I'd be interested to see what they have to say about this. But Mike, I don't know if that makes sense or if I'm
what's
going in circles. Maybe
as
I'm going
opposed
in
to value
circles.
pluralism? I'm sorry, I answer your question with a question.
Yeah.
Why do you hold that Gandhi would be a value monist?
Well, just in the sense of kind of ideas that Samiksha's getting across, in the sense that there's just a single truth. It's not as if stealing is sort of up to the individual. So he'd certainly be against a kind of bold-faced, knee-jerk individualist relativism. But of course, there are more complicated views. I hesitate to call him relativist, though, because I don't know if it's... I mean, I have a lot of thoughts about this because there are a lot of different ways that you could go. One way that you could go is just like a Seller's way of going, where you distinguish between the scientific image, you distinguish between our scientific, rational talk of the world in terms of events, as opposed to the manifest image of persons in the world in terms of our social life, our actions, our morality. And then in that sense, it's just a matter of non-reductions. To me, it's just that the language of the moral language is just not reducible to the scientific image. You're not going to get, and actually this comes out in Gandhi's prescriptions too, because you don't get rules, right? You get advice about whether to assent or not to, an impulsion to action. I think.
Okay, let me respond very quickly, and then Professor Biswas might want to say something. So first thing I would want to say is that there are a lot of people in this conference who are better able than I am to answer your question about how Gandhi felt about particular definitions of truth. But what I wanted to say was in Motilal's reading of the Jains, he says that there's an ethical implication coming out of the philosophy of standpoints. And the ethical implication is directly tied to ahimsa or nonviolence, in that it's a kind of a view of tolerance or accepting not as truth, perhaps, but as accepting the opinions that people give in good faith. So there is a kind of, I think, crossing boundaries there that's healthy between ethics and epistemology that's occurring there in all of these people, in the modern interpreters that I use, like Motilal, in Gandhi, and in the Jains. But I would have to defer to someone else to give concrete examples from Gandhi's work about what he has to say about whether truth is a big T or a small t and that sort of thing.
Yes, I think I will take off from here to sort of give a kind of tentative response to Professor Campbell's question about the epistemic nature of Gandhi's truth. In fact, Gandhi went with Jaina epistemology and the 4 parameters of cognition, which is explained in terms of substantiality, in terms of location, in terms of temporality, and also in terms of some modes of existences that are attributable to reality. But Jaina epistemologists also said that sammakatta is mitthapta. If you have apprehended something, that is mithya or untrue. So any apprehension is liable to be untrue. That is something like a cautionary note to come to a certain kind of pluralistic notion of reality. And that pluralistic notion of reality is practiced by Gandhi, a practice that arises between rule and advice, a practice that arises between a certain political theorization and a certain strategy of mobilization. And in between the political theorization and mobilization, the moral truths, cannot be once again fixed onto a certain purpose or a goal. It will remain non-purposive. It will assume a certain kind of sublimity, which results into a certain amount of ambiguity, non-apprehension. But that non-apprehension or ambiguity is part of our cognitive finitude. It's not part of the real nature of reality. So how does one reach up to the real nature of reality, which Gandhi explains very well in terms of his Anashakti Yoga, which is available for everyone to see. And Gandhi is trying to say that one has to give up the idea of Shakti, the idea of Dharma, and the kind of attributes with which one is lending into the world to move to a different domain, which is partly comprehensible, partly incomprehensible, the domain of Shayadabada. And Gandhi conceives the domain of Shayadabada in terms of human emotions, in terms of human relations, not just in terms of human cognition, although cognition, emotion, relation together forms a bigger framework of epistemology in Gandhi, which I would like to call a certain way of decolonization of the mind, a certain kind of Swaraj that evolves from there, as Kalidas Bhattacharya would be talking about, a Swaraj without the subject, a Swaraj without the object, a Swaraj without the fixed prescriptions. So this without needs to be conceptualized in Gandhi, which probably would be a new mode of understanding of Gandhi, which may partly answer some of our epistemic questions. This is in response to Professor Campbell.
Yeah, thank you. Do we have any more questions? Because we are moving very close to the adjournment of the session, because I think we have only about another 5 more minutes. Any other questions, please? I don't see anything in the chat yet. So if you have the question, if you have any question, please unmute yourself and you can immediately ask the question.
I had something to say to Mike. I don't. Maybe make sure. Well, let me make one little quick suggestion to Mike, because when you were talking about, I think a lot of times when we get caught up in language that other people use when they're using offensive language, especially in the United States, people from the far right often. It's not so much that it's a matter of opinion that we won't allow them to share their opinions, because it seems to me a lot of times they don't have these opinions. They don't believe the things that they're saying. They're saying things to try to upset people. And part of the problem is there's just a defiance of like these Gricean conversational rules. You're supposed to be truthful. You're not supposed to over-exaggerate. And politically, we just don't pay attention to these conversational rules. And I think that creates a lot more problems than the fact that we don't share the same opinions, I'm not sure what my political opponents in the United States even believe. They believe different things once every other week. So political discourse is messed up.
Those are very helpful comments, Joe. On this website that my former student does a podcast, for example, he's an anti-Semite, but he also tends to deny the Holocaust, and he's a liar. So
right.
that's breaking one of the rules of conversation.
Yeah, because you wonder whether he can't really deny it, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Very sorry, gentlemen. We have to conclude. We have to conclude now. Okay. All right. Let me just conclude by just thanking everybody, thanking both the presenters today for some very lovely discussion on the subject. Of course, I've made some concluding remark here. I'm not sure whether I have time to mention it because I'm already overstepping the time which I've given. But I know that when we talk about Gandhiji's approach, Gandhiji's thinking, over the decades, political scientists and sociologists and philosophers like many of us have tried to decipher Gandhiji's statements, Gandhiji's actions and writings in an attempt to conceptualize and also probably to categorize his thinking and ideas into some discernible domains of knowledge. That is the process that we are in, as academics. All right, but many of the primary argument which has been presented is basically whether Gandhiji's ideas are naturalistic in nature, or is it an idealistic point of view, all right, or is it a pragmatist point of view, embracing to the changes that he was experiencing at that point of time of his life. Or even some have also called Gandhiji as a pleasurist. He said, I remember in one of the conversation I had in another person from the Indian subcontinent in Tehran some years back, is he accused Gandhi of being a pleasurist, but the very notion that Gandhi never claimed himself to be a philosopher in the first place. All right. So, of course, the notion of ideas and ideational and also ideology, always, supports or rather, there are a lot of views pertaining to any types of idea or ideational philosophy. I think with that, I don't want to belabor further. All right. I think with that, I would like to conclude the session. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and our both presenters today for giving us a very exciting, a very informative, very thought-provoking presentation. In fact, I've learned a lot. I've jotted down a lot in my book here. And I would like to hand over the session to Dr. Saji. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. Thank you so much, Professor Murthy, and also the two speakers this particular session. Me too, I learned a lot. It was a learning experience for me, especially the conversation that you had among Joe Campbell, Myers, and also Samiksha, the young scholar who has come from Australia. Professor Biswas, as usual, it's very enlightening to listen to you. Even though the session has ended, just one particular comment. Your words are like non-attached dharma. Non-attached dharma. But Gandhi seemed to have been too attached to his culture. Somewhere he seemed to have mentioned that the culture of India seemed to be the best according to him. And much of his propositions later that he spoke were grounded on Vedas. And yet you claimed him to be non-attached, and the dharma that he seemed to have derived from there also non-attached. And then another particular terminology that you had used of the cultural self. If Gandhi is an epitome of cultural self, then he would speak highly of Indian culture. He was against colonialism, especially the materialistic tendencies of the colonialist British then. So I was only making a small comment before I move on to welcome Dr. Deban B. Sharma, Assistant Professor of NEISSR, to propose vote of thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Saji Varghese, for giving me this opportunity to say a word of thanks to a very enriching academic session we had with very qualified, knowledgeable, and academicians and scholars by the name of Dr. Prasanjit and Dr. Myers. And let me first begin with thanking Professor Ravi Chandra Murthy from the University of Kebangsaan, Malaysia, who had very skillfully moderated this very intensive and a very highly philosophical session in most capable way. And secondly, I also personally learned quite a lot. It has been very enriching experience for me, and it has given me a lot of thought processes that I can continue in my responsibility of teaching students the idea of peace and conflict resolution, particularly in the India's northeastern region, which has experienced 60, 70 years of violent conflicts, and it still continues with a lot of uncertainty. So this particular webinar has given me a lot of food for thoughts as to how do we prepare the younger generation by taking clue from what Gandhi experimented on, the whole philosophy of Jainism, taking from Dr. Michael Mayer's input on this idea of Jainism and Gandhiism, how Gandhi took the entire philosophy in tackling with the political issues of decolonization, Indian independence, and how he himself reflected on and measuring himself to what level he has been able to successful by making use of Gandhiism, and also at the same time trying to be open enough not to be bogged down with one philosophy, but making open himself enough to be able to absorb deeper philosophies and principles and moral guidelines from all streams of cultural civilization to be able to respond to a very historically unprecedented time of decolonization. I think Gandhi was born to really take up those challenges to demonstrate to how far we can, to what extent, and to how far a human person in that unprecedented historical period can go into looking into reflecting each and every faith traditions and religious texts to be able to live with and respond to the new realities of the 20th and 21st century, which continue to be still change very fast. And now I feel that this insights that Dr. Campbell, Dr. Michael Myers and Dr. Prasanjit has thrown into has given us a lot of strength to be able to look into the entire campaign for sustainable development as against the climate change and the global warming situation that the modern capitalist economy has brought about. So it has really helped us to ground ourselves to the reality of the indigenous cultures, and at the same time open enough to be able to appreciate all other philosophies and ideas and about how to grapple with the present situation And I'm very happy that Professor Prasanjit has in his ending note, has very in a very qualified way said that non-violent state is a possibility. If you really look at the world through Gandhian perspective, then non-violent state, emergence of a non-violent state in the future struggle towards sustainable life, sustainable peace, justice, and development, we can only think about a non-violent state as a viable state in future. I'm really thankful to all the speaker, and you have really thrown a lot of light into how we make sense of our life and work and situation that in which we live. And I'd like to end my brief word of thanks words by also thanking the organizers and institution that has come around to create this space for all of us to listen to one another from across the world. And so I again would like to thank Dr. Saji Varghese to coordinate the entire effort to create give this opportunity to all of us. Thank you very much. Thank you all. And thank you, Samiksha and Joseph, for further strengthening the entire discourse on this issue. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Yes, that brings us to the close of this webinar for today. Looking forward to seeing you all on the 25th, which is Saturday here in India at